My name is Surandet. I'm 80 years old, and I want to begin by telling you something that I spent most of my life getting completely wrong about negative thoughts. I thought they were the enemy. I thought the goal of spiritual practice and psychological health was to eliminate them, to become the kind of person who simply did not have dark thoughts, fearful thoughts, self-condemning thoughts. I thought that when those thoughts appeared, their appearance was itself a sign of failure, of insufficient practice, of insufficient faith, of insufficient strength. And so whenever they came, I not only suffered from the content of the thought, I also suffered from my judgment of myself for having it. And that second layer of suffering, the shame about the thought, was almost always worse than the thought itself. Maybe you know this pattern. Maybe you have a thought that frightens you, and then immediately follow it with another thought about what it means that you had the first one. Maybe the thought is not the whole problem. The relationship you have with the thought is also a problem. If that is true, stay with me, because what I want to share is not a set of techniques for suppressing or eliminating negative thoughts. It is a fundamentally different understanding of what those thoughts are and what they require from you. And that understanding, when it genuinely lands, changes everything. I was born in northern Thailand and entered the monastery as a young man, carrying a mind that was, to put it plainly, full of darkness at times, fear, self-doubt, the particular cruelty that an undisciplined mind can direct toward itself. And when I began formal practice, I assumed that the path would gradually empty me of all of that meditation was a cleaning process, a purification, that if I practiced correctly and long enough, the negative thoughts would thin and eventually disappear. For years I measured my spiritual progress by whether the dark thoughts were decreasing, and because they were not decreasing in the way I imagined they should, I lived in a kind of quiet spiritual despair, trying harder, sitting longer, judging myself more severely for each thought that contradicted the image of who I was trying to become. And here's what I didn't understand then. The thoughts were not the problem. The problem was my relationship to the thoughts. And specifically, the problem was the belief that their presence meant something definitive about who I was and what my practice was worth. A negative thought is a mental event. It arises, stays for a moment, and passes. That is its nature. The suffering that surrounds it almost always comes not from the thought itself, but from what we do with the thought. Whether we follow it all the way into the story it wants to tell, whether we believe it as fact, whether we use it as evidence about our fundamental worth, whether we fight it with so much energy that we give it more reality than it would have had if we had simply let it move through. The first and most important technique for working with negative thoughts is not a technique at all. It is a recognition. The recognition that you are not your thoughts. The thought appears in your awareness. You are the awareness in which it appears. These are not the same thing. This sounds like philosophy, but when it becomes genuinely real in experience, when you actually feel the difference between the content of a thought and the space in which that content arises, everything about how you relate to negative thoughts changes. You are no longer captured. You are witnessing. And witnessing is a very different relationship from being inside. The second technique is learning to see the thought before you enter it. There is a moment, often very brief, between the arising of a thought and your full identification with it. In that moment, before you have fully become the thought, you can notice it. You can say, "Here is a thought about not being enough," or "Here is a thought about something going wrong," or "Here is a thought that is trying to convince me of something I am not sure is actually true." That naming, that small act of labeling the thought rather than immediately living inside it, creates a gap. And in that gap is where genuine freedom begins. You know what surprised me most? How differently the same thought feels when it is witnessed rather than inhabited. The thought about not being enough, when you are inside it, feels like a verdict about your entire being. When you are witnessing it, it feels like a passing weather event, unpleasant perhaps, but temporary, not a fact about reality, a movement in consciousness. And a movement in consciousness is not something you need to fight, suppress, or fix. It is something you can allow to move through. The third technique is inquiry. Not aggressive inquiry, gentle, honest inquiry. When a negative thought appears, and you have created enough space to not be completely inside it, you can ask some simple questions. Is this thought actually true? Is it as true as it feels? Is there evidence for it, or is it simply a familiar pattern arising again? What is this thought actually protecting me from? What would I feel if I did not have this thought to retreat into? These questions are not designed to refute the thought or to argue yourself out of it. They are designed to bring some light into the relationship between the thought and reality, because very often the thought and reality are not as closely aligned as the thought insists. The fourth technique is the practice of not feeding. This is one of the most practical and most immediate things you can do with a negative thought. Every thought survives by being fed attention. When you engage a thought, analyze it, argue with it, try to refute it, or try to suppress it, you are feeding it, you are giving it energy, you are making it more present and more powerful than it would be if you simply noticed it and returned to something else. Not feeding means noticing the thought, acknowledging its presence without elaborating on it, and then gently redirecting attention to the breath, to the body, to what is actually present in the immediate sensory environment. This does not make the thought disappear instantly, but it deprives it of the fuel it needs to grow into a storm. The fifth technique is body awareness as an anchor. Negative thoughts have a particular relationship with the body. They tend to draw attention upward into the head and abstract mental space. The antidote to that upward pull is the conscious return to bodily experience, the weight of the hands in the lap, the rise and fall of the chest, the contact of the feet with the floor. These are not fascinating experiences, they are simple ones, and their simplicity is precisely their value. When you return attention to the body, you are returning to what is present and real, and the negative thought, which is almost always about an abstraction, about a past event, or a future possibility, or a judgment about something that exists in mental space rather than physical reality, loses some of its grip. What most people don't realize is that negative thoughts are most powerful in the dark of abstraction, in the dark of being completely inside them without any witnessing, in the dark of fighting them with all the energy of belief in their absolute reality. Bring any form of light and they lose power. The light of noticing, the light of honest inquiry, the light of not feeding, the light of body awareness. These are not techniques for eliminating darkness. They are techniques for not mistaking darkness for the whole room. The sixth technique is compassion toward the thought itself. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive. When a very painful thought appears, the instinct is usually to push it away or to be ashamed of it. But a different approach, one that I discovered much later in my practice than I would have liked, is to bring something like kindness toward the thought. Not agreement with it, not validation of its content, but the recognition that the part of you producing that thought is suffering, that there is fear under the critical thought, that there is hurt under the angry thought, that there is grief under the despairing thought, and that suffering, however it expresses itself, deserves something other than contempt. When you bring compassion toward the part of you that is producing the negative thought, you are meeting the root rather than just combating the symptom. And this leads to something that I consider essential. The question underneath the thought is almost always more important than the thought itself. What does the fear underneath this thought need? What does the hurt underneath this thought need? Usually it needs acknowledgement more than it needs analysis. It needs to be recognized as real before it needs to be changed. And when that recognition comes, genuinely and without the added layer of shame, the negative thought often loses much of its urgency, because the thing driving it has finally been seen. The seventh technique is the practice of returning again and again to the present moment. Most negative thoughts, when examined, are not actually about the present moment. They are about the past, replayed and interpreted and judged. Or they are about the future, imagined and feared and catastrophized. The actual present moment, when genuinely inhabited, is almost always more workable than the mental version of it that the negative thought produces. Returning to the breath, to the body, to what is actually sensed in the immediate environment, interrupts the thought's natural tendency to colonize the present with its content about other times and places. The practice of working with negative thoughts is not a practice you complete. It is a practice you return to. The thoughts will continue to arise. They are doing what minds do. The question is never whether they appear. The question is what you do in the moment of their appearing. And what you do in that moment is something you can genuinely learn to do differently. Not through force, through understanding, through the patient accumulation of enough experience with witnessing rather than inhabiting, inquiring rather than believing, allowing rather than fighting, that the whole relationship between you and your own mental life begins to change. At 80 years old, I still have thoughts that are difficult. The mind has not emptied of darkness. It has simply become more transparent about the darkness it carries. And in that transparency, something that used to feel like a prison now feels more like weather. Weather I did not choose and cannot fully control, but weather that passes, that changes, that does not define the sky it moves through. And I am the sky. I have always been the sky. Learning that, slowly and imperfectly over many decades, is the only thing I would call genuine mastery of the mind. Tell me in the comments what type of negative thought is most persistent for you right now. And if this message gave you something honest to work with, stay close to this space, because the relationship between you and your mind is the most important relationship of your life, and it can genuinely be improved, not by becoming someone who has no darkness, but by becoming someone who can stand in the darkness without calling it home.